Welcome to Coffee with Dr. Stewart. This show will provide our listeners up-to-date medical information from a leading neurologist and neuroimmune specialist. Your host is Courtney Stewart, and your medical expert is Dr. Kendal Stewart. So grab your favorite beverage or cup of coffee, and let's have Coffee with Dr. Stewart.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Dr. Stewart. I'm your host, Courtney Stewart, and today we're going to be bringing you the topic of nutrition. But first, I got to ask Dr. Stewart, Dad, how are you doing today?
Doing great. As always, I feel great.
Well, that's good. So before we dive into this topic, I want to ask a couple questions that we got from some of our previous episodes.
Sure.
So first, what are some side effects of tirzepatide?
Okay, so tirzepatide, which is known as a GLP-1 medicine, first of all, the side effects of tirzepatide, in my experience, is much less than semaglutide. So if you're talking about semaglutide, which is very popular also, it tends to have a lot more side effects, but most of the mechanisms of how those medicines work is, one, they do slow the motility of the gut. Now, what you got to understand in most of those peptide medications is dose matters. Mm-hmm. And so mostly the side effects a lot of times come from people actually starting too much and not starting with the right dose. So you definitely want to have those guided by somebody who's a provider or a physician. And the higher you start with the dose, the more side effects you're going to get. So most of that side effect is nausea, slow motility, constipation. So you can actually solve most of those if you get the right dose to start with, you hydrate really well, and you actually don't try to push the weight loss as the primary concern. What you want to do is have it all occur at the right time. Remember, the way these medicines really work is by stabilizing insulin. Yeah. Instead of having surges and drops in insulin, we have a nice steady state of insulin, and we don't get as much surge in our glucose response. So if we don't have to start. Some people I start at about a third or even a quarter of the dose of what's typical for the starting dose. So I ask people, how sensitive are you to medicines? And if they say yes, I'm going to start them very low. Yeah. And that does not mean they're going to have less response to it and what they're after. Yeah. But the side effects of tirzepatide are significantly less, but there are some people that have it. But you can almost always get over it by going with a smaller dose.
And what about rebound weight after tirzepatide or semaglutide?
It's a really big thing, because remember, what gets most people into trouble is the not having satiety, and always wanting to snack. And because they choose a snack that typically is high in carbohydrate, they get an insulin surge. Now, the flip side of that is their body's craving sugars because their cells are saying, I don't have enough sugar in my cell because you're insulin resistant. So rebound is a big problem. I typically recommend for people to go to a maintenance dose that's much smaller than a therapeutic dose. And, it's all dependent on how much discipline you have. And so if you think the medicine's going to make you lose weight and it doesn't require exercise and a good healthy diet and everything else, then you're just barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, because for me, I was so successful on it, but it was because I was eating well, I was working out, and then I continued to do those things.
I mean, it folds into our topic today big time, because nutrition, it's nutrition and good eating is a habit. Yeah. And if you create it as a habit, you really have to do some, I don't know, I would call it rehab, diet rehab, because you got to get rid of the bad habits and you got to create new good ones.
Yeah. Yep. And so y'all probably recognize the guests that we have here from our last episode, which is Bane and Gina Evans. Yes. And so we wanted them to also come and talk about this topic of nutrition, because they do have a lot of experience in that, being in the health and fitness industry. And so I want to start us off today by kind of debunking the myth of what is a diet. I think many people think diet is just a short interval of time where you do something like paleo, keto, carnivore, all these different types of diets. But the real definition of diet is the kinds of foods a person habitually eats. And so making your diet, which is what you eat daily, a balance of that. And so I wanted to ask y'all what your testimony to this is, how it was different when you were younger to now, and what you've learned from balancing your nutrition.
Big topic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Long do you
Lots
have?
to cover.
Loaded question. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I mentioned that Bane and I met while we were doing bodybuilding shows initially, and I think it really took that for me to understand how important your nutrition is, what your diet is, to not only how you feel, but how you look. And so when we have new clients that come to us with weight loss goals, which we tend to correct as fat loss specifically because we don't want to lose just any type of weight. We want to make sure it's the right type of weight.
Yes.
We always kind of lay out the disclaimer that it starts with what you eat on a daily basis. Like nutrition is the framework from which all goals are successfully met. And so, yeah, I mean,
how many people
kind
show
of
up in the
important.
gym on a diet?
Right.
Almost every one of them.
Yes, because like Courtney said, it's they think of diets as whatever the latest trends are, or whatever their brothers, cousins, uncle successfully lost weight doing.
Yeah.
When realistically, there are often strategies and habits that need to be rehabbed in a more immediate way than doing something like keto, which is very involved. Oftentimes focusing on getting more protein and vegetables in your diet is a really, really great, easy enough starting point for people. I mean, easy is relative. It's straightforward, maybe not easy.
But it's not what I want.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to get you necessarily instantaneous results, which is, I think, our culture as a society is often what people are looking for.
Yep.
Well, and that's what that's what I can say. And genetics plays a big role here too, meaning how you're built. And we can specifically talk about that in a minute, about how genetics can define which diet type would be best for you. And I think that overall, everybody just jumps on the latest trend. Yep. I call it the Pinterest diet.
Sure.
Yeah.
Because whatever is going on in Pinterest is what you go to. And I'm sure you guys see that too.
Yes, for sure. When it comes to the fad diets, the main thing that usually typically happens is a calorie restriction at some point too. But once they're done with that diet, they have no understanding of how to get back on their maintenance. So maintaining a proper diet that will sustain their new, now ideal weight loss.
Yeah.
And so then you always just see that rebound of the weight being slowly put back on over a course of time because they went on this fad diet. Now they're going back to how they used to eat prior to. So that's creating those habits are going to be more important for longevity health over just a short
and I'm
term.
sure you're in favor of exercise because of the increased calorie burning capability, obviously, with exercise. From what I understand, you can actually turn up your calorie burn by over 30% just by incorporating a reasonable exercise program in your routine.
Well, and what's great about exercise, in addition to a healthy, balanced diet, is, we can lose weight, technically, sure, by diet alone, being in a calorie deficit, but exercise has this magic ability to redefine, reshape your physique. And oftentimes that's what people are ultimately looking for too. They don't want to be a smaller version of their current shape. They want to be able to see muscle tone and definition and things like that.
Yeah.
Well, from a genetic standpoint, I was mentioning that we can go to MBX Wellness, which I know you guys are clients of MBX Wellness, and we can pull a genetic report, and actually some of the SNPs on there that you can look at very easily can tell you maybe which diet would be more appropriate for you. So we have the fatty acid binding protein. Believe it or not, some people bind fat in their gut better than other people. Some people don't bind fat in their gut very well. Some people overbind it, and so if they eat a lot of fat, they absorb a lot of fat. We have people that essentially have what we call a PPARG, which actually they tend to not burn carbohydrates quite as well. So if they eat a high diet in carbohydrates, they tend to store fat. We have the adiponectin, which is another gene. So if you look at those genes, you can basically get a little bit of a guide for what kind of diet is really more appropriate for you. Yeah. But I can tell you there's not a gene on there that tells you that exercise is not important.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. It is just not there. And so I think that's the problem. Most people want to just do one thing when it really is a lifestyle alteration.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I do want us to break down the different food groups and kind of go into the chemistry
Sure.
of each and why each one is important. So we'll talk which one is most heavily pushed in working out in your daily lifestyle, but it's one of the least consumed. And so I want us to start with protein. And so why does everybody push protein?
Well, so the building block of just about everything in the body is protein. Okay. The other ones are pretty much about energy. Fat and carbohydrates about energy. Protein's about building everything structural in the body. It's built by proteins. What most people don't understand is that protein is actually a relatively low calorie food, meaning that you only burn 4 kilocalories for every gram of protein. But, it's actually probably the hardest for people to get because it doesn't, it satiates you to a certain degree. If I eat a better protein meal, I'm going to feel satisfied for longer, but it's so easy to access carbs because everybody wants that instant insulin fix. What's your typical guideline for you guys for protein intake?
So we usually go through a body composition, or have most of our clients go through a body composition to get some basic metrics.
Yeah.
And then once we kind of touch base, we'd like to kind of see where their protein intake's at based on their lean body mass. So if they're eating, for myself, for instance, I'm going to try to hit around close to maybe 1 gram per pound of body weight or kilogram. So if that's something hard for you to do, we'd start small and then try to build you up. Our main focus right at that point would be, let's see how much protein we can get or close to that number that we want to.
Right.
Yeah.
So
yeah, what Bane's talking about, for everybody knows, they actually have an Inbody Scan in their facility, and basically it's able to separate body fat, muscle mass versus fat mass versus bone mass versus water weight, et cetera. And so obviously, if you have that advantage, the ability to do that, you're going to be much better off. And it's also able to track it very efficiently because it's nice to see the benefits of your activities, you know what I mean, besides just structurally, because most of us, we have a keg instead of a 6-pack. And, even though it might be strong
It's
under
there,
there,
you just
it's
might not be able to see
not able to see it. So
it's hibernating.
Yeah, and so I can tell you personally, it was very motivating for me to go and get the Inbody Scan and see the strides of what my workout's doing, me building muscle, where I'm building it, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, protein's the main macro that we start most of our clients off of. Most diets that you come across protein's always going to be an important macro. It's never not going to be important. So we usually start with that, being that it's the main macro that most people don't get enough of. So once we start there, then we can just add more layers once they get that underneath their belt.
Yeah, so give us some ideas. Courtney, you can chime in here too, obviously, with your nutrition background, of how you encourage people to get that protein.
Well, I think, again, my experience relies pretty heavily on working with women, and it seems that women in particular do struggle with being in a protein deficit, if you will. So when we can figure out what they need to even just to retain the amount of lean muscle mass they have on their body, right now, that's usually a good starting point, but maybe they're only getting half of that currently, or maybe they have no idea because they're just not protein focused or minded. Right. And so oftentimes, rather than thinking about, having smaller, more frequent meals throughout the day, we can say maybe that 100-gram goal or so, which I think is a good general guideline minimum for women for protein. We can break it up into 4 or 5 smaller meals. And so Are you
talking powders? Are you talking...
I mean, ideally whole foods, right? Sure, ideally whole foods, just because everything is so nutritionally available for us, and there's more than just protein that we're getting from whole foods. But if you are finding that you're very satiated from increasing your protein portions, then supplements are a great way to help fill in those gaps, because that's the whole point, right? Is to help meet you where you are. And protein powder is an easy starting point. It's quick, no cook, convenient. You don't have to chew it. And, you know, it's one of our starting points with supplement suggestions for our clientele.
So you typically recommend protein after people's workout or before workout, or where do you typically do? Obviously, you want them to eat in the morning.
Yeah. So if it's something hard for them to get in the morning, we'll try to start with maybe half of their dosage, but we try to get at least a quarter to 2/3 of their protein intake in the first half of the day. So having a little bit of protein before the workout and then after the workout as well. Ideally, we like to see within 30 minutes post-workout.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about the post-workout type of supplements and stuff that you see at GNC and everywhere, places like that? Would you rather it be whole foods for sure?
Like I think Gina mentioned, I think whole foods is going to be the best bet, and that supplements are going to be where you fill in those gaps.
Yeah.
So if you can't hit your allotted amount of protein for the day on whole foods, then that's where the supplements will be a good additive to meet those demands.
I can tell you what's worked for me, and it may be not you, but Cherry a lot of times will cook a nice meal and she'll have leftovers. And where I used to just eat a protein bar afterwards, I go home and I actually get in the fridge and heat up a piece of chicken or some rice, something that really kind of fills me up. And don't you think that would be a better option?
That would be perfectly fine. The problem is, usually, especially in the Texas heat, after a workout, you're not typically very hungry.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The last thing you want to
difficult.
do is go and eat 4, 5, 6 ounces of lean chicken or something like that. So it's just much easier to get a nice cold, pre-mixed protein drink, or if that's flavored, it's chocolate, but it's always going to be better to have a whole food.
Okay, perfect.
Sure.
Yeah, and protein is important because it helps rebuild your muscle mass. Right. That y'all can kind of go into the anatomy of that.
Also, the biochemistry of that is very simple. Protein feeds protein. The problem is carbohydrates feed fat and feeds carbohydrates, but protein always feeds protein. It doesn't get converted very easily to any other storable form of energy.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And so that's why it's so nice when you're focusing on that from a dietary standpoint.
Protein
It is
really is king.
Yeah.
It's not hard to get carbohydrates in the U.S. diet.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the easiest thing in the world. The problem is most people confuse fat being a bad thing, And so when you eat like a meat, like a steak, that fat is not necessarily a horrible thing for you. It's just that most people
between good fats and bad fats.
Mm-hmm.
they get this confused. And I'll tell you, with the older people, they don't know anything about nutrition as a general rule. If you talk to
protein.
You talk to like somebody that's like my mom or my mother-in-law, and I don't mean to sound ugly, but people in their 70s, just 60s, 70s, they just don't know a lot about detail, whereas it's more in the younger community. We've been more educated on that type of stuff.
Yeah, I would say my upbringing in nutrition was not necessarily what I practice today.
No, living in the South especially.
Very high sugared. We had Pop-Tarts, toaster strudels.
Love those things.
Cereals. So it's just very high in carbohydrates and processed sugars there.
Plus, if you're our age, then our parents, went through the low-fat diet, push, where I know my dad was buying margarine, as because he thought that was the better option at one point.
I was a margarine kid.
Well, so and the other thing too is most people will get confused about the type of supplements too, with whey versus casein versus plant protein, et cetera. As a general rule, plant proteins are easily digestible, but they simply just don't have the quantity of protein in them that you can typically get from the wheys or other ones. Only thing is, I can tell you I'm sensitive to whey, and so you just got to be careful and make sure that you find the right one for you.
Yeah, so now I want to move on to carbs. So we're not saying that carbs are bad. Carbs are good.
No.
They are delicious.
So why do we need carbs? I mean, carbs are a source of energy.
Well, so glucose is the primary builder of all energy in every cell. So everything is going to be converted back to glucose. And so in carbs, you basically have a sugar that's going to be converted to glucose to build energy. And because insulin is such an instantaneous hit, meaning that once you take in that carb, I mean, your insulin's there within usually about 5 to 7 minutes, and you're getting this big surge. And so it's the instant gratification. And I'm going to tell you that insulin resistance is a problem, like we've talked about in many of these episodes. And so when your body's insulin resistant and you don't have enough sugar in your cells, your body will tell you, and that is what you're going to want to eat. I like to tell people, if I starved you for 3 days and I put a donut here and a steak here, which one would you eat first?
Most likely the donut.
It's the donut every single time. You would then eat the steak because you'd be starving, but you will always hit that donut first because you want that instant energy load. So the problem with carbs, though, is that all these sugary, not raw sugar, refined sugar type of things are very easily accessible, very inexpensive, very easy to access. Whereas if we could really focus on good carbs, more complex carbs, the sweet potatoes, even potatoes or some type of food product based on that, I think you'd be way better off. You got any opinion on that?
I think at the end of the day, we're of the mindset that there's no bad food necessarily. There are healthier choices and less healthier choices. And as long as you're predominantly eating healthier choices, that's great. It's problematic when you can't identify, maybe perhaps, you don't know the basics of nutrition enough, or not versed enough to understand how to identify food,
Well, it's actually pretty simple. God didn't put anything in a box.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Stay on the
That's how
outskirts of
simple
the
it
grocery
is.
store.
Yeah.
Whole
Yeah.
Foods.
That God
are
didn't put any
superior.
food in a box.
Sure.
So if it's in a box, usually it's something that man's manipulated quite a bit. Okay, but I understand that, especially in this day and age where food costs a lot of money. I mean, it's really, really hard. Eating healthy is hard and expensive. So, but carbohydrates, obviously, you need them. If you don't have them, athletes need them a lot. And glycogen's a very important part of working out.
With our clients, we kind of preach, have more of your carbs allotment around your workouts, before and after your workouts. That way you can help utilize or burn off those carbohydrates in your workout. And then post-workout, those carbs actually help and shuttle the proteins to replenish that muscle glycogen that you lost in the workout. So if you stack those carbs around your workouts where you're really burning off the energy, then it's a lot better for you.
Absolutely.
Fuel and replenish, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. And I wanted to see if y'all could just touch on ketosis and what are the pros and cons with that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. So ketosis with a high protein and high fat diet, particularly. I don't really touch base too much on ketosis. We just prioritize having a large amounts of protein based on what their goals are. And prioritizing good healthy fats, whether it be from the meats or from poly on mono unsaturated fats. So that's olive oils, avocados, things along those lines.
Well, from a ketosis, remember Dr. Atkins' diet, which is a ketotic diet, was based for obese diabetics.
Okay.
That's what it
because
was
I was
made
like,
for.
why would
Because
people
you're
choose
essentially
to go on this
eliminating
diet?
the insulin piece. So these people were insulin resistant, to the point where they were actually diabetic. And so going into ketosis makes you preferentially burn the fat. So it's really not something for a healthy person, and it's really not something for muscle growth or fitness or anything like that. It's basically a way to take a bad situation and try to reduce the body mass in kind of a backdoor method.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just restricting your carbohydrates and primarily taking in fats and protein at a certain ratio to utilize more burnage of fat than carbohydrates.
I can tell you there is a gene that we can check, and it will tell us that you will not respond to a ketotic diet. And that's actually called the FTO gene. They call it the fatso gene. Okay, it's kind of a silly name, but that's what they call it. And those people just will not respond to a ketotic diet all you want. Okay, so genetics can play a big role here if we do it right. The whole idea is that it feeds your body with good food and
it's
good
all
energy.
about balance and fueling your body on the cellular level too.
Right.
Because we're not telling anybody to don't eat this, don't eat that. It's just balancing it and getting what's going to fuel your body right. So with macros and macronutrients, y'all have like a rule of thumb on how y'all.
I think you can generally approach things by, I guess, especially as a habit-based nutrition coaching philosophy, we establish that protein is king, and usually starting with that one is a really great kicking off point to people become more aware of how they're eating and how to make changes. Protein every time you feed your face. And not only will that help you achieve your goal over the course of the day, but it will, being focused on your macronutrients, your proteins, your fats, your carbs is another indirect way of counting calories essentially too, but with a more specific approach. And that tends to reign supreme. I mean, generally speaking, you could say something like a good kicking off point would be 30% protein, 30% fat, 40% carbs, and you can make adjustments there as your body is or is not responding appropriately.
Because each person's different. So like Doctor just said, you can check genetics markers to say if someone has a high fat diet, may not take well to, low carbohydrate diet may not take well to. So you just have to kind of have a starting point, which that 40-30-30 is a really good starting point. And then from there, it's a learning process. It's when we were doing our bodybuilding shows, that was one of the things that we learned a lot about our bodies, what took well to our bodies and what did not take well to our bodies. Yeah. Right. We held on to that information.
Well, so the answer really is genetics acts as a guide. Yeah. So genetics gives us a guide. There are foundation principles that you can't escape, which means you do need all of them. You're never going to be able to eliminate one whole group that you don't need, or you're going to wind up unhealthy. But the thing is, we want to use genetics as a guide. Yeah. And once you have that genetics, we can individually. We used to have to rely on our expertise of experience from taking care of these many people and kind of getting an idea. Now the genetics can get us there a whole lot quicker. Yeah. And we can actually focus in and hone in a lot quicker on what we're trying to accomplish. Yeah. And people seeing it on paper, it's a much bigger deal than hearing it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Especially when it's got your name at the top. It's got your name at the top, and genetics are 99.9% accurate. We don't have to guess at it. Yeah. So that's just the way I tend to approach it, and I know you guys are the same way.
Yeah, you have to play a little diet detective, I think, to figure out what works best for you. And that's why for some folks, maybe the keto isn't the way to go just because it was successful for other people. It needs to ultimately be sustainable for you because, as you said, Courtney, it comes back to what you eat day in and day out, not just for a short-term period to get you quick results.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I would like to kind of touch on the healing properties of food and like low inflammatory diets, gut healing, because I know there's a lot of patients and people who could kind of heal their problems by just changing their diet and what they eat.
Yeah, gut health is complicated, I mean, to say the least. And I'll tell you why. So there's a mutation called an FUT2. It stands for fucosyl transferase. And fucosyl sugars are actually sugars that God has the bowel secrete to grow probiotics. And we have three statuses. We have people who secrete them really well, and they typically have very healthy guts. And when they eat yogurts and other nice fermented foods, they feed a beautiful probiotic base in the bowel. And they don't even really need prebiotics too much. They just grow them beautifully. But then there's this other group who are what we call non-secretors. So they secrete no sugars into the bowel. And so it's like throwing a seed on concrete. Yeah. You just can take all the probiotics you want, and you're never going to get that bowel to really become what it's supposed to be. Yeah. Now, what probiotics do for the immune system in particular is they make beta-glucans, which are specialized sugars, and they also make butyric acid and a few other things that actually help the immune system. And so you can pretty much count that whatever your gut feels like is how you're going to feel. Yeah. If you have an inflamed gut, you are not going to be a healthy person. No. Okay? And, that's the whole gut-brain interface, and they talk about all those things. But the long and the short of it is knowing how to approach that. We have supplements that instead of putting in probiotics, which are very expensive, we will actually put in the beta-glucans because that person can't grow those probiotics. So the whole idea is the gut controls so much of the body. It is so large, surface area. I like to say that if you stretch out the gut completely, it'll cover the size of a tennis court.
Wow.
So imagine how you feel with a sunburn. So let's say you got gut inflammation the size of a tennis court that's stuck in your gut. How are you going to feel? Not good.
Wonderful.
Terrible.
Okay. Now, knowing a little bit more guidance about inflammation, we can control it, but inflammation control is the key to controlling the gut initially. And inflammatory foods, there are obviously more inflammatory foods than other ones. I can tell you the more processed the food is, typically the more inflammatory it is.
Yep.
And so, obviously, if you want a simple rule of guidance, I mean, if you really want to get into this, I think genetic testing is the way to do it. If you really don't have that ability or it's too expensive or you don't have access, what I would tell you is just to go back to the basics of really eating whole foods, meats, vegetables, which we just are just not good at in the U.S. as a general rule.
Foods that go bad.
Yes.
That's exactly right. Now, you also have other genes, histamine genes. A lot of people are sensitive to histamines. Okay? Yeah, Coco. Sorry, Fico, she can't even eat tomatoes.
No.
It's a horrible thing, but those people don't have the ability to break down histamines in foods. And so they, a lot of times, anytime they eat something that's got histamine in it, they react. And there's also food sensitivity testing. There's immediate hypersensitivity where you actually will have your lips swell or your throat feel like it's swelling when you eat the food. That's immediate, but that's not what most of them are. Most of them are what we call delayed food antigenicity, which means that your gut can actually react because it's got, we like to say that 70% of the immune system surrounds the gut because that's the largest area where we can get contamination from.
Yeah.
You understand?
Absolutely.
And so the thing is, we can get a reaction anywhere from 3 to 18 hours later after eating that food. Well, good luck trying to remember what you ate that caused the problem.
Right.
That's true.
And so when we have that type of situation, if you really feel like your gut's in trouble, you need to go visit your provider. You need to start working on it because you are going to feel better.
Now, I do want to hit on some of the different supplements. Supplements saying like caffeine, creatine. Dad, you had mentioned HMB.
Yeah.
If y'all will dive into that.
Yeah.
I think the supplement market itself is so vast and often insane. You know, there's really probably a handful of things right off the bat that I think are worth their while, especially for new folks entering a fitness space. And we've mentioned protein, you know, powders and things before is definitely something. I think creatine is one of the most widely researched supplements on the market and definitely one that needs to be considered for both men and women. A lot of, women aren't particularly familiar with it, it seems.
No, because they don't market to them.
They don't
They
market
to the
them.
males.
And yet women need muscle
strength.
mass as we age as well, too. And that's really important for a variety of reasons, especially, as Bane said, because there's not a point in anybody's lives where protein isn't going to be important. So that's usually a good starting point for folks. But creatine absolutely can help with recovery.
Yeah.
It can help you feel better in your workouts. It can help you retain or maintain your muscle mass.
Yeah. Well, the chemistry of it is basically that the creatine assists in glucose transport into the cell.
Okay.
And the guys like it because if you take enough of it, your muscles blow up, and so you've got these big old guns, and you feel the pump. You know what I mean? But the whole idea is bringing glucose into that cell, getting it ready to recover. So the key to everything to me, and from a cellular perspective, is pulling the pieces apart. So the mitochondria, which makes energy, most people know it as the powerhouse of the cell. It basically feeds off of glucose, but we also then have to have a good thyroid. You got to have a good steroid in your body where there's testosterone, progesterone. You've got to have minerals, and you've got to have methylfolate. And those are the 5 elements that are necessary. So if you're having trouble building muscle or with recovery, you need to have your doctor look over those things, or your provider. I say provider meaning your PA, your nurse practitioner, whoever you have. But they need to look at those things to make sure they're in balance.
Yeah.
You don't want a cake that doesn't have the ingredients and not in balance.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what you want to do too is things like hydroxymethylbutyrate HMB. Those feed the Krebs cycle, which is how we essentially get things prepared to go through the mitochondria. And so all of those things go through the mitochondria, and people actually have genetically different mitochondria. Some people who are, you'll see a family of all athletes. That's because mama was a big athlete.
Yeah.
And mama actually carries the mitochondria. The egg carries the mitochondria. The sperm doesn't have one. So all people inherit their mitochondria from their mom. Okay. And so what we then do is we want to make sure we're feeding that mitochondria. Now, if you have a crappy mitochondria, not a very strong one, doesn't keep us from growing more. So when you talk about something like PQQ, pyrroloquinoline quinone, PQQ was the first substance that ever been shown to increase mitochondrial biogenesis. You can actually grow more mitochondria in the cell. So that's why we use stuff like that. And then we put things in there that take up oxidative stress. You've heard of oxygen-free radicals. So what we have to do when we look at your genetics is we actually are able to tell how well do you handle oxidative stressors, how strong are your mitochondria, how do we go about reducing inflammation and getting you to recovery quicker.
Okay.
Because it's no good if you're so sore you can't walk. I mean, the classic dude who thinks he's in high school goes back to the gym and will not go in again because he's so sore he can't even walk in the gym.
Yeah.
Right? You know that. And so overall, you want to guide on supplements. So we want to control inflammation well. We want to make sure we're feeding our mitochondria. Okay. We want to make sure we're having plenty of protein to build muscle. And then we want to essentially provide the cell with everything it needs from a neural twitch standpoint too. So even paying attention to neurotransmitters and how happy you are and how nice your muscles relax with GABA. I mean, all those things are important.
Took some GABA last night.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah.
And then you got to find some quality people who really know what you're talking about. And so, I mean, I can't stress. I mean, I used to go to the gym by myself all the time and thought I knew what I was doing. Okay. But the reason we're having this whole episode is because I realized that I didn't know what I really needed to know.
Yeah.
And I bet you there's a lot of people out there like that.
Yeah.
Well, to toss the ball back into your court, though, I think, having done genetic testing ourselves, because that supplement industry is so vast and it can get very confusing very quickly, having a targeted supplementation plan is so key to pushing aside the stuff that we don't need to pay attention to and actually, investing in yourself where it matters the most.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Right. You learned a few things about yourself, huh, Bane?
Sure did. Sure did. Now, PQQ has been a staple of my supplements for going on, I think, a year now.
Yeah. And so those are, the important thing is we just didn't make this up. This chemistry has been designed. It's a beautiful design. Unfortunately, we're all not perfect.
Yeah.
We're all different. But what Bane needs might be something completely different than what I need.
Yeah.
And so supplements are there to help you. They're not there. The more you take, the better is not the way to go about it. It's taking what's important and not wasting
what you
your money
need.
on
More
it.
is not always more.
And being consistent at taking it as well, too.
Yeah.
Just like anything, it all comes back to consistency
Consistency.
Right.
and patience, probably.
Yeah.
And then caffeine, I can even tell you in the genetics, we can tell how sensitive you are to caffeine, how you break it down. There are some people that will drink a little bit of caffeine and get so nervous that they just...
I don't think caffeine works for me. Just kidding.
I literally, Cherry can tell you that I drink coffee at dinner and I can go right to sleep.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's probably me.
It used to
That's
be,
not me.
so that's why I used to drink so many cups of coffee.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
caffeine can be a great pre-workout test.
Sure. And it's also an amphetamine. So it does, you do burn more calories when you take it. So, and it makes muscle twitch quicker. That's why a lot of those are banned in IOC sports and stuff. So in general, and it actually keeps you focused because I can tell you I'm the most distractible client that Bane has.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Listen, really appreciate you guys being here.
Yes, thank
thanks,
y'all for coming.
thanks
That's
again
our
for having
pleasure.
us on.
This is fun.
I want to take a chance to basically guide you to their business. It's Hill Country Movement. It's in Dripping Springs. They run a private gym there that they own. Very customized, very personal. I'm sure that if you don't have access or not from around here, I think it'd be very important for you to find somebody that basically gives us functional fitness or describes that, because I'm telling you, by the time you're 35 as a guy, I think for women as a general, unless you're just a top level athlete, functional fitness makes a lot more sense across all the age ranges. But for guys, I think certainly by the time you're 35, you need to. I can't tell you how many guys I know that got into cross training, CrossFit, and just got hurt.
Yeah.
Really injured themselves because they were just trying to do too much for what they thought they were going to do.
Well, and that's where, the coaching and the leadership going through it is very important too. So finding someone that's knows how to lead and coach them through that.
Yeah.
Meeting people where they are, I think, is important. Right?
Well, that's better put. Not to say it's bad.
All right. Well, I think that wraps up this episode. Thank y'all for joining us for another episode of Coffee with Dr. Stewart. Make sure you follow us on all of our social medias and be sure to ask any questions that you have from this episode, and we'll be sure to answer it in future episodes. Thank you and be blessed.
This show is for entertainment purposes only. Please do not use anything mentioned in this show as your own medical advice. Please discuss all medical issues with your own provider.